We're going to speak to Dr David Holmes. He's a criminal psychologist to try and get our head around quite what Khalifa was doing, whether he may have been aided and abetted, whether this was just sheer arrogance in trying to elude the prison services and get himself free, and why hadn't he tried to get further away? So joining me now is Dr David Holmes. David, great to have you on the programme.
And it's very good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon. Right. I mean, this story has captured imaginations over the last 4 days. He has now been apprehended, and one assumes he is back in custody and being questioned by the Met Police. I mean, what struck me, actually, the fact that he appears to have stayed very much in the area where he first absconded to, having got onto that food truck and made his escape from the prison cells. It sort of made me wonder that perhaps he wasn't therefore aided and abetted, because you would imagine there'd be some sort of crack team waiting to pick him up and scoop him to safety. And if that's the case, what's going on inside his mind? Why did he try to do this?
It's difficult to place yourself in the mind of someone that we're not quite certain is a terrorist or not. He's not really been found guilty of such, but lots and lots of indicators that this isn't really such a high-profile terrorist, and there doesn't appear to be some large network of terrorism or terrorism support behind him, and we don't seem to have any kind of external contacts for him either. And he doesn't really fit the absolute profile of a terrorist, if there is such a thing. So I'm not saying he's not guilty, but he's definitely atypical of someone that you would consider to be a dangerous terrorist.
David, what makes you say that? I mean, we've heard reports from people who served in the armed forces with him, who went to school with him, basically saying, well, he was a bit of a class clown. Also emerging reports that he, the two women alleging that he stalked them from a pub one night and was banging on a lot about the amount of money in his bank account, bragging that he had £20,000 odd in there, a big investor in cryptocurrencies. I mean, is this guy essentially a bit of a cad and a fool and a wannabe rather than somebody dangerous?
It would appear to be. I mean, I'm not judge and jury. I'm not going to be, sort of lining things up and making it certain. However, I do suspect the seriousness of his terrorism aspirations. I think he's just kind of followed some idea of what he could gather information that could be of use, but he doesn't appear to have transmitted it. He doesn't appear to have sold it even to individuals or states that would be interested. And his idea of hoax bombing doesn't really fit the terrorist profile either, because why would you bother drawing attention to yourself with false bombs if you had any intent of seriously placing dangerous devices, perhaps under the auspices of some foreign power or foreign group or some terrorist group? If you're going to be serious about this, why draw attention to yourself in this kind of rather foolish way?
Yeah, there does seem to be something that is quite audacious about the way he has gone about various things that he is either alleged to have done or that we know he has done. One being this hoax bomb, which apparently was on his desk in the workplace, which seems, if you were going to create some sort of weapon to harm other people, it seems a bit strange to leave it lying around on your desk when you work for the armed forces. And then, of course, this sort of almost comedic or farcical prison escape, dressing up as a chef, clinging to the bottom of a van. But then when he did actually manage to abscond, he didn't particularly get far. He didn't seem to have much of a plan of where to hide.
No, it quite follows through that I think he obviously had some help in the prison. Nobody can attach themselves to the bottom unless he was incredibly tenacious himself and very, very quick and able. It doesn't add up that somebody can actually tie themselves to the bottom of a van and get away with it and get past inspections and not even have the driver suspect. No, somebody's got to be in on it. Somebody's got to be helping him. But whether that is actually somebody he's become buddy with within the prison, whether he's sort of been amiable, chatty, which he seems to be. He does seem to be a fairly amiable, chatty person, which is, again, not intuitively a terrorist profile. that he's got somebody to help him, but it wasn't some insidious terrorist organization that were paying people off or making sure he got away, because he would have got a heck of a lot further than London if he was actually a terrorist or aligned to a terrorist organization. He would have been probably out of the country by today.
I mean, do you think that it's likely, given that he was picked up in Chiswick, which isn't a million miles away from Wandsworth, I think walkable within 2 hours, and that it's taken him 4 days essentially to get there? Do you think they might have been motivated on some way in actually getting caught in the end? I mean, there are reports in various papers of people saying that he had often told people when he was younger that one day he was going to be rich and famous. I mean, would it be perhaps a bit reckless if we started looking at this guy a bit more like a prankster and therefore answering our own questions of why he was only in a Category B prison? Is that the sort of indications you're seeing?
Those are the indications I'm seeing. But I would, go through with a fine-tooth comb everything he's done and his further past and all the information that he's managed to gather and wherever he's put it, and make another assessment as to whether, foolishly or not, that he could have been a danger to this country. Someone would have picked up on the fact that they've got a loose cannon in the army, in the spec signals, that could be of use to them. Maybe he'd been frightened off if he'd been approached by real terrorists, but he may have succumbed. He may have seen some kind of fame and fortune at the end of it, and done it for those reasons. Very much not a typical terrorist. However, it does not mean to say he's not a threat for this country. But I don't think that he was really an active member of any terrorist group.
What do you think would have been running through his head over the last 4 days? Do you think he might have sort of tried to go past certain windows to catch a glimpse of himself leading the news headlines? Or do you think he's been quite frightened, perhaps, once he had managed to succeed in his mission from escaping prison and then suddenly found himself subject to one of the biggest manhunts in recent years?
I think he probably more likely was going through a very much of a sobering up process, and assessing a little bit of what he'd done, and perhaps realizing that he isn't going to get out of this very easily, that it's not just going to be a matter of getting out of prison and running away and hoping it'll all go away, that he's now kind of #1 news item, and that means that there are going to be serious consequences for him, one way or another. And I think he was probably running a little bit scared, perhaps a little bit egocentric at the first, maybe looking at himself and thinking, wow, I'm on the news. But very quickly, I think he would have seen the reality and the fact that his future is growing very, very small and dim.
I mean, one would assume if he's an intelligent young man and working in the signals and being an IT expert, one assumes he's got some sort of acumen or intelligence, that the risks he's taking at any moment, potentially, he could have been foiled. He could have been foiled when the catering vehicle went through one of the airlocks where they stop and check the vehicle over and make sure that people aren't doing that, clinging to the underside of it. He could have easily been caught by police, given how many CCTV cameras there are in London as it is. Which, does that suggest to you some sort of motivation where he is just extremely risk averse?
I think that he's actually initially was quite sort of ready to take a risk. He was actually, it does beg a belief that even a Category B prison, that someone could actually manage to attach themselves to the bottom of a vehicle and get through all the checks and manage to actually abscond. It's like some kind of B movie, never mind a B prison. It just doesn't seem to add up in terms of real life terrorism and real life sort of person who, is ready to kill, etc. I don't think this guy is, someone who is going to be ready to slaughter people in his path. This is someone who is very kind of quick thinking, witty, and someone who wants to just get the whole thing away from him. He's created some kind of a monster that's going to follow him for the rest of his life.
Do you think that his antics might actually inspire copycats in prisons who may well be abreast of the news and understood that someone's managed to pull off this feat or this stunt and might be thinking, I want a slice of that?
Yeah, there is going to be that kind of possibility, but I would imagine nearly every wagon for the next 6 months is going to be closely inspected from any prison. It's not not something to do is to repeat something that has become kind of nationally famous, because it's obviously something that's going to be watched for at every level. But perhaps other methods, and realising perhaps that the prisons are not quite as secure as they should be. They're under stress, they're under manned, and they're really becoming very insecure.
Indeed they are, and lots to carry on discussing on that topic. Dr David Holmes, criminal psychologist, thank you so much. Joined now in the studio by Matthew Larzer, who's going to be with me for a big chunk of today, actually. You're looking quite delightful, can I just say?
On the hottest day of the year, you know, as are you, Alex, of course.
Oh,
but
we've
you always
quite colourful, haven't we?
Absolutely.
So, I mean, it's interesting, David Holmes there saying, and as a criminal psychologist, he just doesn't get the feel that this guy is some sort of hardened terrorist, that actually, if he had been, you know, paged through to people in Tehran and actually mix it with that sort of level of either, you know, criminal statecraft or the criminal underworld, he'd probably cack his pants, quite frankly, and that he may be little more than a prankster who just kind of pushes things too far. I mean, do you think that could account for why he was allowed to work in the kitchens, why perhaps they weren't taking him very seriously, why they might not have considered him a flight risk, but maybe just a silly young kid who's
why he was there in the first place and not in Belmarsh, where the most serious prisoners are put? Yeah, I think it's entirely possible that actually that it to turn out that he's, as you say, a kind of prankster, a chancer with a rather odd story. He thinks, as you say, this might be his 5 minutes of fame. I mean, as David was saying there, it's sort of, David, you were saying, B movie, B prison. I mean, think of all those movie producers who last week were writing the scenarios, the script for this great film, and then it sort of ends, and he's managed to get a sort of 1.5 miles, 2 miles away to Chiswick. In London terms, he hasn't even left the zone of the transport system when London's divided into zones. He hasn't even made it.
Subject to ULEZ still.
Exactly. He's probably in the original ULEZ zone. So I think it is just an absolutely extraordinary tale. But there is, as David was saying, a very serious sting in this, which is he got out of what is meant to be a very secure prison. This isn't an open prison. He's not, you know, he's not in there with, you know, politicians who've been sent for wrongdoing and white-collar criminals. And yet he's been wandering the streets of London in the shadow of the prison almost for a few days. And the official report on this prison is extraordinary, which calls it not only vermin-infested, unfit for purpose, understaffed, but also that the very front door hadn't been sorted out after a previous prison escape. So I think yes, in a sense, we're all going to be slightly laughing at the fact that he got caught a few miles away and he hadn't made it, you know, literally barely out of the neighbourhood, never mind out of the city. But actually, it's serious questions need to be asked about our prisons.
I mean, it's good. It's a good thing actually, because incidents like this do shine a light, and we found out just how packed our prison system is, and lots of questions now being asked, which we'll be discussing later on in the show, about whether the idea of longer sentences is creating backlogs, that we just don't have a big enough prison estate.
Well, half of the prisoners, Alex, in Wandsworth are foreign nationals awaiting deportation.
What a great topic to get our teeth into
That'll get the callers
shortly. That will get everyone going.
But literally, I saw a former prisoner speaking about it this morning and says that roughly half in Wandsworth are people just waiting to leave the country.
That is utterly astonishing. And yeah, I mean, you know, that opens up all sorts of debates when it comes to the ECHR and deporting criminals and so on and so forth. So lots for us to get through after a short break, which we will be taking just now. Don't go anywhere. I am going to be with you until 4 o'clock. We've got so much more to discuss on this case of Daniel Khalife, who's now been arrested by police, apprehended in Chiswick, not too far away from Wandsworth, where he had ducked out of prison on a catering van, laid low for 4 days. But the police have got him. They've nabbed him. He's back in custody. So what does this mean for the prison system? That and a lot more coming up after this short break. Back in a moment.